Originally, I wanted to look at the Zapruder film to test out some computer programs to remove the blur from images. And I thought I might find something in the film. The people that were helping me provided me with scientific arguments, knowing I was a physicist, that to show that these arguments for alteration were incorrect. And sure enough, I tested them and applied the physics, and it turned out that these arguments were incorrect. But when I was doing that, other effects popped out, things that hadn't been claimed before, and I realised for the first time that the film was inconsistent, that it couldn't possibly obey the laws of physics. Now, most of the film is perfectly correct. Most of the physics is right. 99% of the time when you examine the Zapruder film, the technical aspects of the film are correct. You can apply all the physics you like and it works out perfectly. And so when you find one or two examples that just stand out as being completely incorrect, that really throws you, because you understand what's going on with the film, and suddenly here's something which is impossible that hits you in the face. For a couple of days after I realised to myself that this was really happening, that the Zapruder film had been altered, in fact fabricated, was created. It was a fraud, it was a hoax, and for a couple of days I was just shaken. You know, as a physicist, you just assume that the things you're given are genuine. If someone does an experiment for you, they give you real data. They usually don't make it up. You analyse things and you work things out. And to find that what everybody has been assuming to be the real data, the genuine article, is a fake. And I'd been doing deblurring of the frames, and now and again you come across things that didn't seem to quite work out correctly, and you just assume it. As a scientist, the natural assumption is not that there's something wrong with it, it's that there's something wrong with you, that you don't understand something about the film. And within the errors, you try and find an explanation for any anomaly. You assume that if there's a problem, that the problem is with yourself. That's the way a scientist works. And you don't look for mistakes. You don't look for the thing to be fake. You look to try and expand your own understanding of how the film works. When I did an early video clip where I deblurred Jean Hill and Mary Moorman standing on the grass, because that was a big controversy at the time, whether Mary Moorman stepped into the street or not. And I decided I'd put together a video clip showing them stationary in the film, not moving around, and removing as much of the blur as possible. And I found that Jean Hill was standing there with her hands clasped like this. And by that stage I was already aware of her testimony where she yelled out, you know, "Hey, Mr. President, you know, take a photograph, look this way so we can take your photograph." And to see her stationary and her head just snapping like that as the only animation, I started getting uneasy, feeling that this looked like an animation when I was starting to investigate whether the film could be a fake. I still wasn't sure. That wasn't enough evidence. The fact that someone stands there stock still doesn't prove to a scientist that the film's a fake. People can do that. But when I analysed the Stemmons freeway sign that David Mantic had found increased in width into the sprocket hole area, and I'd been told that the argument was the pincushion distortion of the camera lens. And sure enough, when I checked it out, mathematically, the sign got wider because of the pincushion distortion. But when I found that the sides of the sign, it was the only object in the film that I had ever seen that didn't obey the distortion of the lens. It was put in over the top. And to me, that was the clincher. That was the smoking gun. The film had been altered, at the very least. That didn't tell me at the time that the film had been completely fabricated. And that took other pieces of evidence. The science that I used in analysing the film, the physics that I used, the principles of physics, are not recent inventions of physics. This physics has been around for hundreds of years. The optical equations and the principles of optics go back to Newton's time, as do the basic laws of motion. So we're talking 350 years of physics in terms of understanding how things should move and how the optics should work. So someone in 1964 could have done the same calculations to know where things should be. Someone in 1864 should have been able to do exactly the same calculations as to where objects should be in the film. If I had to sit down and put together a film in 1964, as long as there was someone operating the equipment to do the photographic cutting and pasting, the calculations were easy. You could have done them with a pencil and paper. I could do them for you today with a pencil and paper. Someone in 1964, many people, much more experienced than me, involved in photogrammetry or mensuration, which is the measurement and analysis of photographs. It was a well-known field. It's almost like Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. The scientists that put together the film did an excellent job. It's a magnificent piece of work. And 99% of the time, all the properties, all the optical properties and the motion and even the jiggling of the camera are beautifully done. But once you hit that piece of evidence that tells you this film violates the laws of physics, this film didn't come through the Zapruder camera, then it's almost like a game of people that lived 40 years ago. It's almost your wits against theirs. Can you find the next piece of the puzzle of where they made the mistakes? And that's why you really look back at the life issues that were published the most rapidly, the life issues that were published in the first days and the first weeks, because under the pressure of time and uncertainty and the full scenario of the assassination had not yet been worked out, that's where the mistakes would happen. Not for all the frames in between that were created at leisure to make a smooth transition between what you showed in those early days. The places where the mistakes were made were those key frames that were published, and most of the time they left their bases open, but in one or two cases they made a terrible mistake. And once you latch onto that, it's really a game of Sherlock Holmes to find the next step. There was no pressure on me from my employer to stop working on it as a school teacher. In fact, they were quite enthused about it and wanted to know more, because everybody in Australia continues to be affected by the assassination. They see the events in the world and they want to know how the balance of power was changed. Most Australians didn't believe that were alive at the time. Tell me they did not believe the official story from the start. They didn't know what happened, and they don't get as much information as you do in the United States. We don't study it in history at school, except in isolated cases. A colleague of mine does run a history unit on the JFK assassination, and is hugely popular. And any time I sit in front of my students and I start talking about the assassination, they're absolutely dead quiet. They have 1,000 questions. They want to know everything about the Cuba and Vietnam War and all of the people involved, and I could speak all day and they'll listen, and they're not falling asleep. They're vitally interested in modern history and how this affects the world as we've grown up in it, because I wasn't alive at the time of the assassination. That change in America changed the whole world. And where I sit today as an underemployed physicist in some way may be traced back to what happened in 1963. It changed the world.
Welcome to the Zapruder Film Symposium, Is Seeing Believing in the Death of JFK?
My background is in engineering and physics. In Australia it's slightly different the way our degrees work. Our undergraduate degree in engineering basically qualifies you to be an engineer. I did engineering, got hooked into physics, so I completed a Bachelor of Science in Physics and then went on and did PhD in Physics. Currently I'm an underemployed physicist. I'm a school teacher teaching mathematics at Mentone Grammar in Bayside suburb of Melbourne. However, that gives me a bit of fair time and a bit of flexibility, spare time and some flexibility to look at things like the assassination without any sort of pressure from funding agencies, which in Australia all the universities are run by the federal government. And I met up with some colleagues last year and they said if you were still at Melbourne University working there as on the staff, as I was a few years ago, you would have been tapped on the shoulder and told to work on something a bit more serious, because people have been told that in the past. So it's a strange confluence of events, a few strange coincidences that that has brought me here, and again I thank Jim for inviting me here. Let me first start off with the Zapruder film as I look at it these days. I tried to put together the most complete form of the Zapruder film, including everything I knew about it, even after I knew that it wasn't a real film. You can't start by criticising the Zapruder film and saying none of it makes sense to me. If I said that to you, you'd probably say, well, you probably don't understand very much about the film at all. A lot of the film does make sense. Technically, the film is very good. In fact, it's brilliant, as I'll mention in a moment. And it's only the deviations from that technical perfection which really tell you that something is wrong, okay? Against a background where everything is actually correct and there are things that are impossible, that's what tells you that you understand what's going on, for a start, but then you come up with the evidence that it's just not genuine. So if I present some things which tend to make it look as if the film is more genuine, that's the background against which I'm putting it against. So this does not quite look like the Zapruder film that Jim put up this morning. It's slightly warped from what you've seen, and it's got a couple of extra features. This is just the first frame, which is a bit bluer. Roland Zavada's famous first frame overexposure, which unfortunately is not here to discuss with us. But there are a number of things, I might use the pointer on here. There are a number of things that have been done with this from the MPI disc, which is where these frames come from, or at least the ones that weren't skipped out. The size was wrong. MPI made a number of mistakes. Laser pointer, yeah, I could do with that. Thanks. Jim's mentioned many of the mistakes that MPI made in terms of completely skipping frames. So the numbers were wrong towards the end of the film. The earlier frames that were missing weren't MPI's fault. They were actually spliced out of the film in the early days. But the size of the film was wrong as well. If you get the DVD, the claim is that it's incompetence. All of these things were just incompetence. And Jim's frames, unfortunately, weren't corrected for the fact that they're stretched horizontally. And that's one thing that Jack has struggled with and I struggled with originally. And when we came together some years later, we found out that we came with exactly the same solution. It's also something that's thrown at me as a red herring. As recently as just a month or two ago, you probably didn't take into account the MPI frames are stretched. And I said, well, you're a couple of years behind the times, because that was an old issue. Down here, you see I've got this blue mask over the things that aren't as interesting. We're going to look at some of the sprocket holes, well, one particular sprocket hole later on. But I've covered that over. What we've got here is some extra little panels which actually come from the frame before. There's no frame before the first frame, so that's black, and the frame afterwards. So this is frame 1. This comes from the top of frame 2. In fact, it comes from this area. Well, actually, there are frames before the first frame. There was a bit of footage of who was it, the Hesters and Marilyn Sitzman on a park bench that comes before the film, which has got an interesting twist of its own, and Jack learnt something yesterday. He saw the full version of that, which is something like 50 or 60 frames, not the 6 frames that you often see. In fact, it's hidden on the end of Grodin's version of the Zapruder film. I happened to be playing Grodin's version in front of my students one day in class, because they've seen all this stuff many times. It's the one way to get a class of students to be absolutely quiet, start talking about JFK, and every single one of them wants to know about it. Every single one of them. The interest, from what I hear from Jack, the interest among Australians is probably more than the average American. I've had maybe one student that says that's in the past, why worry about it? It affected Australians, we're very close allies with the United States, as the recent war illustrates. We rely on the United States for our defence to a large extent, and people were worried and continue to be worried about what the assassination means in terms of recent history, world history and world power. And people that were alive at the time tell me that they never bought the official story. I don't know whether we're more sceptical than Americans. We've got a convict background, so we don't take well to authority. And so I've actually got a quota from Robin to get 2 laughs out of you, Jim, so I've already got 1. So I only noticed the extra many frames at the start of the Zapruder film where Sitzman actually turns right around. Jack posted one that I'd posted from the Groden film. And it's very strange if you look at the Zapruder report and other things as to what happened to all of these extra frames at the start of the film. Not just a fraction of a second, but many seconds worth showing them sitting on the park bench. That's just one fascinating aspect which I won't touch on again today unless somebody asks me. So this is the first frame. You also notice the edges are sort of a bit bent. And that's got to do with the pincushion distortion, which I'll talk about. I'll go right back to basics and give you a rough idea what pincushion distortion is. This is, if you like, the final product where it's all put together. The frames that were missing, as Jim has done with his frames, I took the frames off Robert Groden's disc and put them in to this copy. I actually sized them and colour corrected them as much as possible so they look like they're part of the same film. The only thing is you'll notice that they don't have any sprocket hole area, but when you look at it at full speed, it's almost seamless, except the very last frame I didn't do a very good job with. I just wanted to play it for a little while just to talk about some of the things on the actual film that I'll be discussing, so they're not taken in isolation. You've actually seen them running full time, so you know what I'm talking about when I come back to them later. So if you like, this is a preliminary run through. Now Jim stepped through this and played the 4 versions of it earlier today. This doesn't look quite the same because of those differences. There's other things with the MPI version as well. The version on videotape, as Jim played, seems quite colourful. The version on DVD seems to have had the brightness brought down and the colour saturation washed out. Now, Gary Mack says, oh, that's just because the film's getting old, but many people here know what Gary Mack's answers are usually like. Well, I'll just start to talk about a few things. What we actually have, and I'm going to talk about this later, if we just look at the normal area between the sprocket holes, David Mantic investigated this in the National Archives when he first had a chance to look at it before MPI put out their version. I might turn it off so we don't get too motion sick. These ghost images. And the explanation for them, which seems to make good sense, and I'm looking forward to pulling apart that Bell & Howell camera because I haven't actually pulled one apart